vCluster office hours, May 30th. Welcome. We're going to go over some use cases. I'm here joined by Kurt, who is actually a solutions engineer and does this stuff for a living. Actually, he shows customers how to get stuff set up and helps them figure out POCs and everything. So Kurt, what exactly would you say you do here?
I am a pre-sales engineer, I guess. There's lots of different names for it, but I do a lot of demos. But I show our commercial product, our commercial offering to potential customers. I run proof of concepts with them, and then I try to help them, test out different use cases. I have to admit, like a lot of times, I don't get as deep into all the production use cases because typically once they become a customer, we hand them over to our support team. And so I don't get as deep in the weeds sometimes, but definitely touch upon some of these use cases we're going to talk about today.
You kind of show them like the possibilities, right? Like you get them thinking about what they want to set up, and then they may have 10 different tools that you haven't used that they need to integrate, and then you might show them how it kind of works together.
Well, also, a lot of times people that come to us to talk about the commercial offering are using vCluster. And so they
Okay.
know what vCluster is to some extent. They're not aware of what additional features we have for our vCluster platform and our pro distribution. So it's more kind of
Gotcha.
highlighting how those work and how those can help them with specific use cases, or if they solve a specific pain in some use cases where they're having a very specific pain with the open source vCluster, and we actually have a commercial feature that helps with that.
And for everybody that's here too, we have a version that's coming up here in the I don't know what the time frame is, but we have a free tier and stuff that you'll be able to try out so you can see the UI and everything too. Like so if you're using vCluster on like the CLI and you want to see what the UI looks like, you'll be able to deploy that with the vCluster platform. And should have more information on that in the coming weeks. But let's go ahead and show off the agenda. So we did our intro. I'm Mike Peterson, tech marketing. I do demos too, record videos, webinars, stuff like that. Try to answer questions if I can too on Slack. Like I said, join our Slack if you have questions after this and you want to follow up with like engineering, or if you try anything that we're talking about and you run into any issues. Yeah, join slack.loft.sh and hop into the vCluster channel and you can ask anything that you want. But what we're going to talk about today is use cases, right? So some of the common production use cases are listed here. Like a lot of our customers seem to like to use vClusters for like GPU. And what do I mean by that? I mean like handing off Kubernetes clusters that give access to GPUs, fractional GPUs and stuff like that. So if you're doing anything in AI ML and you want to have a Kubernetes cluster, but you don't want to spend the money on a graphics card per user or graphics card per like a team or something like that, you can use like virtual clusters to kind of split that up. And some of the other like more common use, it's I'm saying GPU, but it's also just another form of multi-tenant SaaS, right? Like all this stuff is kind of like multi-tenant SaaS. How do I get as many people onto a Kubernetes cluster as possible? And kind of like virtualization used to be, how do I get like 80% usage, or how do I get like higher usage of the cluster so I'm not just wasting, space? And then how do I also, I think Kurt, you've seen this recently, how do I even scale up after I've hit that 80 or 90% and I can't schedule anything anymore? But mostly multi-tenant SaaS. So what do you see, Kurt, for customers most of the time when they come in? Like what's their first like a production idea? Like what do they want it for? SaaS demos or
No, a lot of times it's somebody that's been using namespaces for multi-tenancy for either internal or external customers, and so they're running in all kinds of different issues, and so they will basically want to explore how V clusters can kind of extend or enhance that multi-tenancy, add different levels of security, add scalability. One thing a lot of people don't think about with V clusters is that it instantaneously offloads API activity on the host cluster, so it instantly reduces load on a lot of these large clusters that are doing a lot of work. Have lots of tenants, and that API server is being hammered. So right away, by moving workloads to V clusters, you make that host cluster more stable. So those are they're looking for stability, they're looking for extra security, better isolation, and those are all the things that vCluster gives them.
awesome. And then for some of these on here on the production, I'm going to show some architecture diagrams, but we also have use cases on our website, which will be in the description for YouTube on these, like some case studies. So if you want to read more about it, like what they're actually doing with it, you can check that later. But we've got a couple of customers that have actually posted stuff publicly about like what they're doing. So like CoreWeave's doing GPU access with virtual clusters. I know they have like KubeVirt that they're using for virtual machines, but I think for handing off Kubernetes clusters, they're using vCluster instead. And then we've got like CodeFresh, which has done multiple presentations at KubeCon about how they're doing hosted Argo CD with virtual clusters. And then we've got Atlan, which just provides a SaaS server to virtual clusters, and then Ada, which does development workflows with virtual clusters. But we can go ahead and take a look at this first diagram, which we're not going to go too deep into because you'll end up wanting to watch the presentation about this instead. It's like 45 minutes or something like that, and it was at KubeCon in Chicago. So I'm going to link that, like I said, in the description. But this is kind of what CoreWeave is doing. It's a little bit small for me to see. Like the vCluster is just kind of like they're using vCluster Pro, the enterprise production model, but I think they probably started out with vCluster in the beginning and then moved over to this. Kurt, I don't know if you helped them that much with this. I think this was like right before you came in to the company that they got this set up.
Although there is a really kind of important feature that we added to the vCluster Pro and the vCluster platform called isolated control plane that we actually built on behalf of CoreWeave, kind of in partnership with CoreWeave. So basically what that allows you to do is run the vCluster control planes on a different cluster than where you actually run the workloads for the vClusters. And why that is appealing should be to lots of different organizations is like a lot of times your workloads need expensive nodes like with GPUs or anything else, or more expensive CPU, better memory, whatever it may be, better storage. And you don't want to waste the capacity for those nodes on control planes that don't need that performance, don't need GPUs. So that way, also, they have actually really built some of their own stuff around our platform as well that gives them some additional kind of isolation for those control planes, the way they manage those, because we're actually talking about external customers here, right? So it's not just like, hey, this is a fun science project for internal developers. This is actually like production. They're trying to make money. So they're trying to, get as much money out of every GPU that they can, in the vCluster platform, and the vCluster Pro distribution are helping them do that.
And I posted something interesting too. If you want to check this out, recently stumbled upon this from my boss who sent it over, where OpenAI is talking about scaling Kubernetes to 7,500 nodes. And what they're doing too is that most of the big cloud companies and stuff, they're offloading the control plane onto a control plane cluster, right? Like it could be like 3 or 5 that they can scale up, and then they've just got all these worker nodes that they're connecting in. So moving the API off of the nodes and onto a control plane or a dedicated control plane, and then providing SaaS in that way is pretty common. Anyways, I think OpenAI was saying that they were getting too many hits on like the API, and they had to scale it off on the outside so it didn't mess the worker nodes up. Anyway, something cool to check out.
Another thing too, we just had an article recently on our blog site about running the control plane on ARM-based nodes because they're typically less expensive. And you don't need the performance of AMD 64 or whatever for the control plane. In all of our containers support ARM. So by all means, a lot of times you can even get a discount by using ARM, and especially like in AWS or something like that. So I don't know about CoreWeave. I don't know what the architecture of the chip architecture is for where they run the control plane, to be quite honest. But that's just an interesting additional way to save money.
A lot of the production stuff that's secret sauce, so we can only give so much away that we actually have. So like, here's another one that's actually public, and I'll link to this. This is CodeFresh's diagram showing kind of what they're using vCluster for to do hosted Argo CD. Well, I got Octopus deploy now, right? Like I think that they were picked up by them, but they've talked at length about how they're doing this, and they're doing the same thing where they're deploying multiple vClusters and they're spreading out API requests to those vClusters instead of the host cluster API. But I think this example is Kurt's bread and butter. Do you want to talk about like what you see?
Yeah, actually, I kind of stole their idea, but I modified it a little bit by using our commercial offering and to use crossplane with our vCluster platform instead of just utilizing the open source Helm chart like what they did. But yeah, basically they're using crossplane. They created extended object in crossplane that actually creates a vCluster that has Argo CD in it. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but like everybody's aware, like Argo CD has a lot of custom resource definitions, right? Applications, application sets, etc. If you're going from one like big version change to another, those CRDs can change, and you can't run those CRDs on the same host cluster. Like they're global resources, they will clash, they won't work. But by managing each Argo CD instance on behalf of a customer as a SaaS platform in a vCluster, they can update it, they can whatever, they can restart it without impacting anybody else. So even if you're not doing this as a SaaS for external customers, this is still kind of a really cool way to run Argo CD at a very high scale for large organizations. And so, yeah, the talk that I did for PlatformCon, basically did the same thing, except rather than use any Helm charts, I used all native custom resource definitions because they're and actually I went one step further and actually like created I'm basically spinning up a vCluster with Argo CD using Crossplane for a pull request because vCluster spin up so fast, like spin up in a minute or or less sometimes even, and then I'm actually putting Argo CD in that vCluster just for that pull request, building the code for that pull request, and actually even using Crossplane. There's a GitHub provider, so I can actually create a webhook in GitHub for that Argo CD throwaway instance, and everything's throwaway. As soon as the pull request is closed, the webhook's deleted, the Argo CD and the vCluster are cleaned up, and there's nothing left over. So it's kind of a neat way to do things, and utilize the capacity of the cluster to its maximum ability.
That's pretty awesome. All right, so let me go to the next one. This is just like a diagram that we have, and it's kind of showing like what you might see if you're running this in AWS and doing like multi-tenancy. I wish I need to move this. It's on my small screen, so I'm just there trying to like see the things. Let me open it up so I can kind of describe the image again a little better. All right. So it's just kind of like showing like what you can do with AWS. Like I think, all right, I guess that's a question. Not how many, but are a decent amount of our customers and people that are using vCluster you've seen using EKS, AWS? Are they rolling their own? Like how would you recommend it?
Wow, no, I mean it's all of the above, and a lot
All
of
of it?
times
Okay.
it's either multi-cloud or hybrid. We have people that are a mix of bare metal and cloud, but almost in all cases, they're always talking about wanting to go to multi-cloud, and
Okay.
vCluster doesn't inhibit that in any way. vCluster can run equally well across all clouds, bare metal, any Kubernetes cluster, OpenShift even.
All right. So this diagram's kind of showing like how you've got the host cluster, which could be EKS or something like that, and then how you got to do URSA mapping to make sure that you have access to create these resources in AWS, which is probably one of the most complicated parts of it, right? Like starting the vCluster might be easy, but then as soon as you start adding in like all of these other plugins for cloud vendors and stuff, you gotta work with URSA. So would you skip some of that and work with like Crossplane and use Crossplane to deploy some of these resources? Like I don't know the best way to do that. What would you usually recommend? Or just go base URSA and then spend days figuring out their setup?
Yeah, no, I guess it really depends. I would not recommend Crossplane necessarily to somebody that's
Okay.
not used it if they're.
Yeah.
But I did want to point out one kind of cool thing. I think you have RDS on there.
Yeah.
Hard to see maybe for some people, but one kind of cool feature we have for our vCluster plain vanilla Kubernetes distribution is the ability to support RDS as its API storage, and that really just gives you kind of incredible scalability for any kind of vCluster control plane that you need to be very highly available. Because RDS can scale across AZs, even regions. So you can have a control plane that actually has basically an etcd that's scaling across regions. So it's pretty wild.
That's pretty awesome. All right. Anybody, if you have questions too, like that you want to like ask, feel free to ask them in chat too, or put them in the QA.
Yeah,
We have a QA section,
please
but
ask
like
questions.
yeah,
We
we'll
love
also
to
answer
answer
stuff like
questions.
on the fly. Like it's not super formal or anything like that. We're just kind of presenting stuff, and then yes, this is here for you if you have questions or. All right, so let's go. Okay, so now we kind of talk about some of the production stuff. Like I said, I'll link to that in the YouTube so that you can watch in the YouTube description so that you can watch the presentations by the people from the companies. That way you can get a little bit more insight into what they're doing. They're kind of going to go over and describe. It's going to be like 40, 45 minutes for each of those presentations. But I think the CoreWeave one, and I think even the CodeFresh one is definitely worth watching. But like I said, I'll link that, and then I'll also link the case studies if you want to see what users are doing in production with this. But another use case that we're going to go into, so we're going to do the dev test preview, and then I got a couple of diagrams to talk about that. So another common use case, which is what you might start out with if you're not doing production, is like dev environments. That's something that people are like, hey, I've got this Kubernetes cluster, I'm spending all this money. What can I do to reduce costs? So you're going to set up dev environments. So what you're going to do is separate the cluster into multiple vClusters. You're probably going to have like one virtual cluster per developer or team, but they're ephemeral and they come up quick and then go away. So you could have multiple virtual clusters per user if they wanted it, right? Like you could emulate, multiple Kubernetes clusters and they can do whatever they want. Like maybe they want to test different. We'll go to test, just talk about that in a minute. So the requirements can differ from the base cluster, which you kind of see a common theme in dev test preview where the developers can deploy their own things into virtual clusters that aren't managed by the platform team on the host cluster. So they can test things and try things, right? Like they want to try a different version of MySQL or something. MySQL's an old thing. If they want to try a different version of MySQL from that, they can. If they want to try a different CRD of anything else, they can. All right, so we got a question. vCluster Pro can be deployed in our own EKS clusters. What are external dependencies with Pro? So yes, you can. Actually, let me let the person who's the pro at this. Can you use EKS and vCluster Pro, or even just vCluster open source?
Yeah, and I kind of want to make a distinction. We've kind of been also going through some kind of naming convention changes. When we talk about vCluster Pro, we're talking about an enhanced distribution of the vCluster instances themselves. And then we have the vCluster platform that is also a commercial offering that allows you to manage vClusters at scale across many host clusters. In either case, there's no really dependencies other than Kubernetes itself. Maybe, I can't think of what version we go back to, but probably 1.23 even up to the most current version. So really, there's not really any other dependencies I can think of. It's really just we require Kubernetes to install our platform. It's self-managed. It's not a SaaS. You install it yourself as a simple deployment, and then a vCluster requires a Kubernetes host to run on. It can be any certified distribution of Kubernetes. Actually, probably uncertified as well. But yeah. So I mean, also a really cool thing about vClusters is that the version of Kubernetes that you run on the vCluster can actually be different by a major version. So you can run like 1.30. You might be waiting for your central team or your infrastructure team to upgrade your physical Kubernetes clusters. You're stuck on 1.26, but you need to test something for 1.30 maybe. You can actually install that on a vCluster on that 1.26 host cluster. So
awesome. And so basically, users can try new things, CRDs, without modifying the base cluster API, because when you're installing a CRD, it's going into the vCluster API, and the host cluster API stays the same. That way, the platform team's not getting upset, or you need more permissions to install things.
Right.
And like, we don't want to support that. But yeah, low cost.
Also, because they spin up so quickly, that it's not a big deal if you blow something up inside your vCluster, just delete it and spin up another one. They spin up in a minute, So yeah.
I do that with VMs, and it takes so long, but like doing it with containers has been a much better step, right? Like I remember, well, now I'm using like just Terraform to deploy stuff on my Proxmox, right? Like, and it takes like 4 or 5 minutes for that to finish. But like a vCluster, yeah, like if something messes up within it and it was working previously, delete and then just redeploy and then just stand everything up again. It's
right.
super
with
fast.
No impact to anybody on those clusters.
Yeah. So yeah, low cost and impact on cluster. So it increases optimization of resources, and you can spin it up in minutes. I say minutes, but it can be less than a minute, right? It just depends on how fast it comes up and gets stored and everything.
Well, and also what workload is attached to it at startup time.
Yep.
So
yeah, if I've got like a bunch of stuff that's getting started with it, it might be, I don't know, what's the longest you think you've seen with any of the demos you're doing? Like, how long are you waiting for? Like, because if we go back to production and stuff, like you've got
maybe 90 seconds.
Yeah,
90 seconds. But I'm sure like in some production use cases, it's probably longer if the workloads are quite large.
But Kurt's got something pretty cool that maybe we'll be able to demo here in the next couple of months, where he's dog fooding, right? So he's using virtual clusters, vCluster, like that's another production thing you're talking about, showing demos, right? Like being able to quickly stand up demo environments to show things to customers, right? Like what do you usually do with that? Like do you want to
yeah. So and actually, I mean, so I used to be a software engineer, and I would have loved it then, but that was pre-Kubernetes days before I switched over to sales. But eventually in sales, we adopted our product Kubernetes, and we're using Kubernetes for demo environments. Also for kind of hosted trials that we'd host on behalf of potential customers. But that was still expensive, and we would spin up entire physical cluster. We were in Google Cloud at the time, so like spinning up a GKE cluster, every couple of days or whatever, maybe even more often than that. And then have to remember to make sure you clean up after yourself and so forth. So with coming to Loft, every single demo environment I run, I install the vCluster platform in a vCluster. So actually, when I demo a vCluster, it is inception. I am doing a vCluster and vCluster pretty much every day, multiple times. Sometimes a vCluster and a vCluster and a vCluster. Actually, just yesterday, I needed to test installation of a vCluster platform, and I was doing it on a vCluster running in a vCluster. So yeah, it just because everything in our platform too, and everything with vCluster is easily managed as code. It just makes it very easy to kind of to simplify, to parameterize, and to use whatever tools, whether it's GitHub Actions or Crossplane, whatever it may be. You can just automate the creation of these environments that spin up in minutes or less.
So you can have like a POC for a customer in like a couple of minutes, especially if you've got like reference architecture that you're building it off of, and then they're just like, oh, it's already ready. You're like, here, do you want access to something that's doing what you want? Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't done a lot of that. I'll say a lot of times most of our prospects want to do a POC on their own infrastructure.
That makes sense.
But certainly something to think about, in the future.
Gotcha. All right, so we've got another thing. Thanks from Joe. We love vCluster and deploy the Pro image by default. I was just wondering if Pro Platform was adding a dependency on cloud service providers, and what I'm hearing is no. Yeah, we don't want to lock you in to which provider you're using. We just want to make sure. So each provider's got different like versions of Ursa, right? Like and stuff like that, where you need to figure out permissions and what you can actually like hook in and set up service accounts so you can access things and do things, right? Like that might take a little bit of work, but like I don't think we're not trying to lock you in anywhere. Like Kurt said, we've got customers
Yeah,
that
I'm
run bare
actually
metal.
surprised. In my previous role, I will say there was probably a lot more AWS than anything else, but here it's been
Okay.
very even between AWS, aka Azure, Google Cloud, and bare metal. It's really been pretty even. So and it works everywhere. You know, yeah. So
And what Joe's saying is with the version 0.20 did something on it last office hours last month. The default image
yeah.
is now the Pro image, but that's the Pro features are not enabled by default, right? That's like a paid service, but you're using the Pro image,
Right.
which is a better image than what we were using previously. It's based on what is it based on?
Chain guard. It
Yep,
uses
a chain
chain
guard
guard
to
to
Alpine
ensure
before, right?
the supply chain.
Yep.
Well, chain guard just is not an image itself. It's a company that
Company, yeah. Yep.
basically check make sure that
So like
images are secure and so forth.
0 days and stuff should be fixed and patched pretty quickly, and they maintain and manage all that stuff. So you start with a good secure image.
Right. It also allows you to adopt the commercial offering more easily.
Yep.
So
yeah, so the idea behind that is like basically you've got these different flags and stuff that you can configure using a vCluster.yaml now instead of using a values file and some other configurations, and everything is now in this vCluster YAML where you're defining, which I'll say makes a couple of things a little bit easier, like exposing it with ingress and stuff. You're defining everything in a single YAML file. The base image is now Pro, and it's also K8s instead of K3S, but you can
and there's
change
only one
that.
Helm chart now. We used to have a Helm chart
Yep.
for each distribution. So now it's just a value in that vCluster YAML file, that where you specify which distribution you want.
Trying to simplify, right? Like I think we had some feedback, which it's a little bit difficult to get started. So the documentation's all kind of new. I think if you're looking to use something that is stable right now, I'd still say try the version 0.19. But if you want to test,
Derek had a question in the chat. Yes,
okay.
Derek, it does support AKS clusters, 100%.
And I think we've seen GKE too. And also there was recently a question about OpenShift, right? So I think you can do it. It's just basically Kubernetes. If you're using Kubernetes.
Yeah. Actually, I won't name the customer. I don't think we have, but they basically are a huge OpenShift shop. But they're big, like there's a few people in the company that are big proponents of like plain vanilla Kubernetes. And they want to use vCluster to expose their users to plain Kubernetes because they're not able to get off OpenShift yet. We don't virtualize OpenShift. But we can run on OpenShift because down at its core, OpenShift is Kubernetes with such a few kind of key differences here and there.
Gotcha. All right, so here's a diagram I made for like a dev example. So this is kind of showing how the platform team will access the host API to create a namespace, like dev namespace 1. They would create that, and then they would deploy a virtual cluster into it, and then that's what you're handing off to your developers. And what the developers are doing is they're accessing that virtual cluster through the vCluster API, which you're probably going to expose through ingress, and it's not going to be the base cluster. So they don't even really know about the base cluster. They don't have access to the base cluster. They just have access to this vCluster, which looks like Kubernetes to them. Kind of like
if you gave them a kube context and they didn't know it, they would think it was a real cluster. If they didn't know it was a vCluster, they'd have namespaces. Especially if you give them cluster admin, they'd see all the namespaces. They create namespaces, but all that just remains virtual inside that one host namespace.
Awesome. So this kind of looks like, so this is like one of the most common examples. I've got a cluster. I want to split it up. I want to give it to developers. I don't want to give them their own entire EKS cluster, and it saves cost and it's pretty quick to spin up. And then when that developer doesn't need it anymore, they can just delete it. And in I think one of the feature sets of the enterprise and stuff is that you can actually have these auto sleep if they're not being used. So it's just watching for connections. So you can save money there too, and you can kind of just load them up with more, and then you can like set a quota for how many developers can have how many like vClusters per like team or user. But
one other important,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, just real quick. One other real important cost saving capability is to sync. You basically, we showed how you had CRDs and don't sync those, so you can develop different versions of CRDs. But on the flip side of that, you can sync other things that aren't synced by default. So, for example, you could sync ingress resources from the vClusters to the host and reuse the ingress controller of the host, and then you don't actually have to install that ingress controller in every vCluster. So, you name it, all the different things that you typically install in every single physical cluster, whether it's observability, logging, whatever it may be, you can reuse those if you want to. But at the same time, on the flip side of that, in that same host cluster, you can have another vCluster where you may want to test that kind of stuff when you upgrade those components, and you can keep that vCluster isolated in that same host cluster and install those. So it's kind of really gives you the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and if you go to vcluster.com too, there's like a workflow showing like how all that works, right? Like it shows like how you can kind of take all of the CRDs and minimize it, and then you're not replicating across each one. Is auto sleep a free or pro feature? I believe right now it's pro, right? Like is the sleep still part of
Sleep
let me
is
syntax.
pro. Yeah, actually was that? Yes, sleep is pro feature.
Let me put a
Or
link.
a platform feature. There is a pause mode for the with the CLI, the open source vCluster CLI. You can manually pause that. So there might be something you can do to automate that some way. But there's a pause, and I don't know
I'll
what
put
does
this link in here.
in a wake
All
up
right, so here's an
command for the
actual.
CLI.
So I'll post it in the chat. Here's an actual like link. Ignore the pricing. If you go down to the actual plans, like this is kind of showing you like free it is a little bit different than OSS, but it kind of gives you an idea of what is enabled and what's not enabled in the let me put the docs too real quick. Oh, put the docs. If I go into the docs, like what I'm talking about is like if you go to the vCluster YAML, I'll post here too. You can see that if you open up like policies or something like that, then you've got central admission controller, and that's got like a little pro tag. So that kind of shows you what features are open source. If it doesn't have a little pro tag next to it, that means it's open source. If it's got a pro tag, then that's something that is a enterprise feature and that you would want to look into. But for the most part, you can get a lot of stuff done without going to the pro features. So you can do a lot of POC and configuration. But then if you get to a point where like you need some of the isolated control plane, which means that you're not running workloads on your worker nodes. You're keeping everything off of there because by default, the open source version is going to run the pod and API and all that stuff. It's going to be running on your worker nodes, right? So if you have an issue with running that on your worker nodes and you need to be a lot more, I don't know, if you want to run just good workloads like the Access GPUs and you don't want to have like +1 or +2 pods running and you have to keep it very optimized, then you would want to run it somewhere else. I don't know if you want to add to that, Kurt. I think you're
Well, the only
better
thing I want to
describing.
mention, a little bit of a sales pitch here, but there's the platform. We have a free version of the platform as well, but you
Yep.
can see it's limited in its feature set. But actually, if you install it, you get a 14-day free trial of all the features for the initial 14 days, and then after 14 days, if you don't actually purchase one of the other tiers, then it falls back to just the feature set that is in the free tier. But anyways, I just wanted to mention that in case somebody is interested in trying things like sleep mode or any of those other features.
So yeah, so open source dev example like this, you can do all this with open source. This is the open source version. You don't have to pay anything. You can get started. You can do this, and then you can probably even like write some of your own stuff to help with like the pause and like that if you want to at certain times, right? Like you can add some logic to say, hey, pause these vClusters, and then bring them back up at like whenever someone's coming to work. But let's go to the next one. So test environment. So similar use cases dev. However, now you're going to test before staging in production. Ephemeral, like one ephemeral cluster per test, you can kind of set up. I'll show you the diagram in a second. So you can spawn a virtual cluster to run the test instead of an entire cluster. So you're spinning up in minutes instead of like 30, 45 minutes for an EKS cluster. And then you can delete the cluster when done to reclaim space. So like a test example, like Kurt was saying, is I can run different versions of things. I'll let you talk this in a second, Kurt, but I can run different versions of things. Like I can run K3s in my virtual cluster, and I can have K8s as the base cluster, or I can run a different version of Kubernetes in my virtual cluster. I can have a second version of my app, so I can test that out. I can have CRD, maybe a step up for a different version. Like maybe something just went to 1.0, and I want to make sure that everything works before I try it out. Maybe they've changed like some of the mappings in the spec or something. I want to make sure it actually works. And then I can install a different CRD that's not actually on the base cluster if I want to try that out too. Do you want to talk to this one, Kurt?
Well, yeah, and then also we have a CLI that both for the open source, the vCluster CLI,
Yep.
and it's also enabled for our pro version. And so you can basically use this CLI in any of your favorite kind of CI or any automation tools. That's one way to do it. Obviously, there's a lot of other ways with Helm charts, and with the pro version we have CRDs too. But yeah, as you mentioned, you can run. Not only can you run different versions of Kubernetes, but the thing that I find really cool is because their vCluster is so lightweight. You might be doing some complicated Kubernetes development where you need to test your solution across many versions of Kubernetes. So you can actually spin up these vClusters in parallel with all the different versions of Kubernetes you need and run those tests much more cheaply, much more quickly. So yeah, and much more more quickly. Yeah, and I mean, just open up lots of possibilities for testing.
I'll say this is a very common one too, right? Like whenever we're at KubeCon or something like that, people are always saying how they're either using it for dev, test, or preview, or they're doing all of the three. And then we always get questions like, is this production ready? And yes, it is production ready.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's
I mean,
kind of
yeah, no, we have a lot of people come to us in sales where they've been using it for development because that's where they kind of dip their toes in and they like it a lot. And now they're like, wow, we see how we could use this for different production use cases. That's why we're talking to you. Either they want, some people want to make sure they have support when they take that next step, or they're just looking for additional features. But yeah, 100%. This is kind of very much an early adopter vCluster use case.
all right, awesome. So preview. So preview environment similar to dev and test. You can create the ephemeral virtual clusters so that you can hook it up to. Well, let me let you talk this one in a second, Kurt, because this is what you do like all the time too, right? Like this is your test environment. So you can hook up GitHub Actions and Argo CD to deploy virtual clusters or Flux or anything. Like you can use Argo CD or Flux. That's most of the diagrams. I'm not putting like what to use. You can automate exposing the preview environments with Ingress, and then they can be created within minutes, and then you can destroy it when you're done. You can install the CRDs in there if you need to test something that's like a full stack. And it can be different than the base version. So like the diagram's kind of this, right? Like the arrows kind of abstract away a lot of stuff, right? But the idea is, dev one puts a pull request in, spins up a virtual cluster in a preview namespace, and then they get like a preview environment of their application. And then dev2 can do the same thing, so they can quickly test. And these spin up so fast that they could see that they broke something. They can make another update, update the pull request, and then you can spin it up again, and they can see the changes instead of running it as a application like in a namespace by itself. It's a little bit easier to clean up and delete, I think, in the virtual cluster.
Yeah, and it plays very nicely with like Argo CD application sets. And again, I'm not like trying to use one solution over other. I just spend a lot more time with Argo CD than I do with Flux. But basically, like with the pull request generator for application sets, you can kind of make this opt-in as well. You may not want to create a preview environment for every single pull request automatically. So actually, the pull request generator for the Argo CD application sets has a feature where it actually attaches to, like, it gets triggered based on a label that you put on that pull request. So you can create like a custom label, like create preview environment or whatever you want to call it. And so as soon as they add that label, it triggers that application set that will then create that application for that pull request. And so then we'll build whatever you want that is specific to that pull request and deploy it however you want, whether it's Helm or just manifest or whatever it may be. So that's a pretty awesome way, including creating the vCluster either from Helm or from our CRDs if you're using the commercial product. So that's a pretty slick way to do it.
It'll create the vCluster, and so you can have it hooked into your base cluster. It'll create the virtual cluster. It'll pull the kube config there, and then it'll deploy into the virtual cluster all the stuff that you want to like test, right? Or preview.
Yeah, and I kind of glossing over one we do. I do want to highlight that we do have this one commercial feature that automatically adds a vCluster to Argo CD. So if you're not actually installing Argo CD into the vCluster, which would work. It works really well because then the vCluster can just be the local Argo CD cluster. But if you're actually like spinning up vClusters and then using a different Argo CD instance outside of that vCluster deploy, we have a feature with our commercial offering that will automatically add that. It's not too much work for you to do on your own to do that. Yeah. We're not going to dive into that today, but with open source, it's possible too. And I guess there's different people out there doing it with open source as well.
It's a Helm chart, right? So you're basically deploying an application with Argo CD to get the virtual cluster. With the Pro, it's a CRD, but with
well, I mean, as far as making the vCluster available in Argo CD as a cluster target, that's the kind of, we have the secret sauce that automates that as part of the vCluster platform.
But even with open source, it's super easy, right? You're deploying a Helm chart to make the virtual cluster, and then you're deploying into it. I was just trying to add the open source side too. So you can do all this stuff. Like there's people that actually have presentations that are out there doing all this with open source too. Like if you look at CodeFresh and everything, and they built their own and they did everything. And the enterprise thing makes it easier, so you can get started like day one. But if you want to tinker around and like mess around and like do your own, you can too. Like there's a lot of information out there about like how you can get it set up, and there's actually diagrams and presentations. It'll be super helpful. But
that's right.
That's kind of where we're going with the examples and stuff that we have. You can, if you have any questions or anything like that, we can go over it. Or if Kurt, if you want to talk about anything interesting that you've seen with like production environments or kind of issues that you've had to solve? Maybe I don't know. We went through it pretty
Oh
quick.
gosh. Yeah, no, I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, I want to make sure that nobody has any questions because I'd
Yep.
love to answer any questions anybody might have first and foremost.
Yep. Anybody have any questions or anything like that they want to ask about like any of these use cases? I can kind of go back if you have any questions about like the production stuff. I think how can we determine capacities and limits of vCluster? Okay, so do you mean like how much usage does it take up for the Kubernetes cluster itself, or do you mean like how many vClusters you can run on it? Because it's the open source version. It is a pod per vCluster, right? So you've got a pod and some other stuff that actually gets the stateful stuff that gets stood up. So if you want to run something in a virtual cluster, there is a very small tax of running that pod. So you're going to be limited there. But
Yeah, and depending on the distribution that you select, we have
yeah,
limits and requests that are baked into the vCluster Helm chart as kind of a starting point. Obviously, depending on the workload, the vCluster control plane may need more CPU memory depending on the size of the workloads that's running in it to some extent, right? But again, it's just a pod. The vCluster is well, it can be more than one pod with open source sometimes, but and depending on whether you're running HA vClusters or non-HA vClusters, but one vCluster can be as small as just one pod with one or two, with like two or more containers, and so yeah, typically we're talking very minimal amount of CPU and memory limits and requests, and you can here I can link to the latest values. Oh, actually, it's for the latest beta, but if you want to take a look there, it's in there.
Awesome. And if you're
But good
saying like
question.
how
That comes up quite a bit actually, because also I do want to point out that there's like it is a pod. So like we have some people that have massive clusters with tons of pods, and there is a limit to how many pods you can run on a node, how many pods you can run in a cluster. You can modify those up and down to some extent, but at the end of the day, there's a limit. There's no magic with vClusters. If a pod's running as a workload on a vCluster, it still counts as a pod on the host cluster. So you're still going to have those limitations.
also say like how can I determine the capability capacities and limits? So if you're talking about like limits about what you can deploy into it, it's just testing it, right? Some CRDs like KubeVirt and some other things may have like weird rewrite rules and mappings to figure out what the resources are, to where you might need to do a little bit of work to figure out like how to get that to run properly. But I say just test it, right? Like it's still, I'll say it's brand new, right? Like it's a couple years old and stuff too, but like we don't have the capacity to test every single CRD that comes out. So it'll be like
there's a lot of them.
them.
That's impossible, right? But
Just some
I also
testing
want to point out
on
there's so like we have a really good documentation on like for native resources, whatever you want to call them.
yeah.
Like we have a very good documentation of what's synced by default, what can be synced, and how it's synced. Like for example, storage classes are from the host cluster are automatically available so that you can create persistent volumes in your vClusters. But then after that, we also have this kind of generic sync, and then on top of that, we have a plugin SDK. So anytime things get really complicated, you can actually write a plugin that kind of does whatever necessary rewriting or non-rewriting, syncing, whatever it may be, patching and so forth as part of that plugin, and just about anything's possible if you write a custom plugin for it.
We had a question about that in Slack, I think yesterday too, where someone was asking, why is my config map getting like rewritten or something? But the link that I sent there shows you like what's enabled by default and then what's disabled by default and what you would want to enable. Like you're probably going to enable ingress, sync and stuff like that. So you're not managing, or the users aren't managing their own ingress. You're just giving them ingress and some information. All right. So do you have automated scripts for running?
Yeah, I was going to say Robbie's question. Yeah, actually, we have I'll see if I can find it. We're in the process of rewriting our documentation or restructuring it, updating it. But we do have load tests in the scripts available to load test. So I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but yes, I think that's.
I'll see if I can. Let me add that to my notes, and I'll see if I can. I'll link to that in the video.
I was just looking at it the other day. Now I can't remember where it was.
Let me find it. Hold on. I've got notes. Okay, here it is. Office hours notes. All right. So load testing. So I'll put the load testing links in the description. So what's going to happen is after this is done, it'll probably be like 2 or 3 hours, and then this will be uploaded to YouTube. And then what I'll do is I'll put all the links to the things that like I went over there, and then like I'll also put the load testing on GitHub, and you can check that out. And then if you have any questions, like I said, just join Slack or something like that and reach out to us. All right. And then, yeah, so like I was going, like the sync. So some things will sync by default. Some things are disabled by default. A lot of the built-in Kubernetes stuff is going to be kind of easy to sync. Once you start getting to custom CRDs, like Kurt was saying, you might have to do a little bit of work to figure out how to actually map those. You can sync stuff from the virtual cluster down to the host cluster, and then you can sync stuff from the host cluster up to the virtual cluster. So like what we've done with the newer version to make it easier is even exposing the engine or the ingress class to the virtual cluster, because that's useful. Like if someone wants to deploy something and you've got multiple ingress classes and you don't have a default set and they want to install or set up an ingress resource, that's very helpful to know. Like, oh, ingress class Nginx, and then get it configured. Or if you're using like traffic or something like that, you can switch it over. But if you have feedback on the docs, let us know too. Like a lot of this stuff's brand new. We have an awesome tech writer now that's been, reformatting this. We think this is a little bit easier to understand because everything's going in the vCluster YAML. What we need to work on is get a little bit more guides and stuff to kind of show different examples, which is what we're in the process doing.
Yeah.
We've got videos, if you go to our YouTube, that kind of go over some of like the day one vCluster stuff, like how do I get the kube config? How do I sync resources? Unfortunately, some of that stuff is going to be deprecated because this version 0.20 is a big update for vCluster compared to like some of the last couple ones. So, but a lot of the some stuff holds true. It's just it's configured a little bit differently. So we'll try to update that.
I found the load testing on the old version of the documentation.
Okay.
So I shared the load testing link there.
Yeah, let me put that in the link too, just so we can do it. Because we had questions, I think, too, recently in Slack. That's a good place to go. Is like Slack. We had questions about, hey, have you all been doing load testing so that we can figure this out? Because a lot of like it seems to be a lot of intern stuff. A lot of the companies are sent off to go, hey, go load test this for us and see how this works, or figure out like where this breaks. And we just didn't have a lot of the load testing information or set up. And I think a lot of the companies that were using it maybe had that internal. But if you do load testing and want to share it back, that'd be awesome too. Like the community would love it. Load test stuff. So I'll share with you what we have. Like I got to go find it on the video. So since we send the video out, I'll put it in the links. And I think there's basic stuff on GitHub where we just started kind of showing and doing load testing so that we could show that to the community and to customers. But yeah, I'll share those. Let's go into the hosting panels. I never see it. So Robbie asked, could you please share your load test scripts and everything? All right. Do we have any other questions, or are we wrapping up? Anybody want to ask anything else? I can go ahead and move on to the how to get involved or ask questions if you want. Yeah, there you go.
And remember,
Thanks,
the community channel's out there. So
yep.
Yeah.
All right,
always
so
ask questions there.
Check out GitHub. You can join Slack, read the docs, and then you can follow us on social and everything. Like we're trying to post more videos and stuff on YouTube to show demos and examples, and then we've got some webinars coming up next month too that'll kind of go into multi-tenancy versus single tenant and like what benefits you can get from that. And that's basically it. Thank you, Kurt. Do you have anything else you want to add in, or if there's any last minute questions, feel free to ask them. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything in the Q&A. Oh, we got one more. Okay.
Nothing to add, but thanks for having me. And yeah, I mean, one thing I know you don't always have time, but try to search or look at the docs before you ask a question sometimes. But I know that's not always easy. But yeah,
just like
a lot of answers.
Jump in, start firing questions off without looking and reading.
Well, sometimes when I go to check out the community vCluster channel specifically, and I'll go look at something I don't know the answer, I'll go to the docs and find it and share it. But it's a lot of times the answer is in the docs. So
we got one more question from Derek, and then let me add to what you're saying there. It's a good point because our team is distributed, right? Like, and we do have engineering teams and stuff watching and trying to answer questions, but they may be in the EU, they may be in India, or they may be in the US. So depending on your time zone, try to provide as much information as you can. Like if you've got a vCluster problem, let us know what version you're using. Let us know what you've got deployed or something like that. That way they don't ask a question and then the next day you come back because they're like 12 hours different. They've asked you what version are you running, and you say, oh, I'm running version 19, and then like the next question gets queued up, because usually I think the same person tries to kind of answer it so that it's not like changing context too much. All right, but we got something from Derek. So we checked out Acuity for managing Argo CD as a service in the hopes of managing individual vClusters, but it wasn't compatible. Any recommendations? Well, we have I'm actually interacting with someone at Acuity, and we're getting some stuff set up for hopefully a July webinar. We'll actually be talking about how to use vCluster and Acuity. So hopefully we'll have more information for that for you. But maybe Kurt could.
Yeah, I mean, if you
with Acuity.
I haven't done anything directly. I've spoken to them. They've reached out to us, and they're actually
Great
working
team.
on. They want to get vClusters working with Acuity. So yeah, but 100%. If you want to set up a call with more details, we're happy to talk to you. But yeah, I mean, hopefully in the near term, they'll have something that allows you
Yep.
to use vClusters with their offering.
Yep. Already working with Christian over there. Christian,
You could probably, we could get it to work today, probably with lots of extra work, but they want to streamline it and make it easy.
Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you for the question. All right, let me make sure we
Yeah.
have anything else.
Thanks, Derek.
I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining. Like I said, this video will be available later if you want to watch it again, or like if you have any questions about. Awesome. Let's see that. Okay. Yeah, if you have any questions or anything like that, reach out, let us know. But thanks again, and then hopefully we'll have either. We might not have office hours at the end of next month because we have 2 webinars coming up at the end of the month. We'll see. If not, we'll probably try to do another one early July or maybe earlier in June. But if you have any requests we can cover, that'll be great. Maybe start showing some demos and stuff like that, I think. But thanks so much,
Robbie,
everyone.
reach out to us. We might be able to set something up, Robbie.
Yep.
So, yeah, for sure.
All right, cool. Thank you so much. See y'all next time. Thank you, Kurt.
Bye-bye.